Hi, welcome to the virtual tour of the Haymarket Martyrs Monument. I'm Amy Binns-Calvi. I'm a volunteer with the Historical Society of Forest Park who is sponsoring this video. I'm glad you can join us for the video. I really hope that you can someday come in person to visit the monument in person. We give tours the first Saturday of every month during the summer, and it's really powerful to be here in person in front of a monument that is a monument to arguably one of the most important events in labor history, not just in Chicago or America, but in the entire world. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, you can find more details of it in the book The Day Will Come, Honoring Our Working Class Heroes. You can contact the Historical Society of Forest Park to find out how to get your copy. It's fantastic. It's published by the Illinois Labor History Society. And one of the authors of this book is Mark Rogovin. I want to give a shout out to Mark. He gave this tour for many years, and I was lucky enough to learn about giving the tour from Mark. His dedication and passion to preserving this monument has enabled us to still enjoy it and other generations in the future. Sadly, we lost Mark last year, but he is still here at the monument. His memorial and his remains are here. He is still overlooking the monument for all of us. I also want to point out this really incredible bench that has been placed here in 2018 from the Pearsons, and they're passionate advocates for human rights. And they have this bench here, and you'll see that it's facing exactly the monument. And what's really powerful, the words that they had inscribed on here, and it reads, "Sit and hear the voices for peace, justice, and freedom." And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be listening to some of the voices from the past and here honoring a really important moment in labor history. And hopefully the wind won't be too disruptive. So if I do this, I'm covering for the wind. I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about the historical context of the events at the Haymarket. So in the late 1880s, during the Industrial Revolution, workers' rights were more or less non-existent. The average working week was 100 hours for workers during the Industrial Revolution. So in 1884, there was a movement among unions, and unions at that time were a little bit siloed. So like the pipe fitters would have their own union, the lumber shovers would have their own union. So there was a gathering, a convention of various unions to get together on one topic, and they wanted to advocate for an 8-hour working day. And the slogan was 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for work, 8 hours to do as we please. So they started organizing, getting more and more unions on board, and they even reached out to the more radical element of labor activists, and that would be the anarchists. At first, the anarchists were a little reluctant. They were obviously hoping for more dramatic change than just an 8-hour working day. They wanted to challenge the whole capitalistic society. But eventually, when they saw how many people were getting behind the 8-hour workday, they too got on the bandwagon and started to advocate for a general strike on May 1st of 1886. May 1st, 1886 was a beautiful day. Here in Chicago, it was an amazing spring, warm day. Thousands and thousands of people across the United States walked out of their jobs for the general strike. There's some estimates that it was up to 300,000 people. 80,000 people were estimated to have walked off their jobs here in Chicago. There was a massive march down Michigan Avenue. Some people say 80,000. That's probably a little debated, but it's safe to say tens of thousands of strikers marched down Michigan Avenue, led by one of our martyrs, Albert Parsons, and his wife, Lucy Parsons, and their children. You can imagine how threatening that was for the capitalists and the industrialists whose offices were probably perched high above Michigan Avenue to see these tens of thousands of workers on strike for an 8-hour workday. It was a peaceful day. May 2nd started. More and more people started to walk off of their jobs. The organizers of the 8-hour workday were going out and still advocating for more and more people to join the movement. Albert Parsons, who was one of the martyrs, went to Ohio to talk to some people to get them on the 8-hour workday. May 3rd, August Spies, who was one of the martyrs, was giving a speech for the Lumber Shovers Union outside of the McCormick Reaper plant on the south side of Chicago. There had been an ongoing strike at the Reaper Works, and what would generally happen is when there was a shift change, the strike breakers that were in the Reaper plant would have to pass by the strikers outside, and there was quite often a lot of confrontation, as you can imagine, between the two sides. Now, some of the strikers had actually joined the general strike, but there were still strikers that were in the McCormick Reaper plant. So as August Spies is standing on top of a train boxcar giving his speech, he realizes that it's time for the shift to change, and he implores the people that are there to hear him speak about the 8-hour work week to stay, that it's a peaceful movement. But they can't help themselves. They go to join the strikers outside of the factory gates. There's a lot of chaos, and the police fire into the unarmed crowd. They end up killing at least 2 workers and injuring several others. August Spies sees this happen before his eyes, and he's horrified that the police have fired into unarmed strikers. He rushes back to, he is the editor of a German newspaper, the Arbeiter Zeitkunde, the Workers' Times. He goes back to the paper and they print off a flyer to pass out to say this is what has happened at the McCormick Reaper plant. The police have fired on unarmed strikers. And he starts advocating for a general meeting on May 4th, the next night, at the Haymarket, which is the intersection of Des Plaines and Randolph in Chicago. Many people were conflicted about having an open-air meeting. It had been known that the Pinkerton guards that were hired by a lot of capitalists and industrialists would go to open-air meetings and sort of foment violence. They would disguise themselves as protesters and create havoc. So people thought that it might be in an unsafe environment, but they could not find other halls to hold this meeting. So they decide on the Haymarket. It's hastily pulled together. August Spies asks that a bulletin be printed up advertising about this mass meeting. And one of the editors, Fisher, who is also buried here, on the first run of these posters, puts out a line, "Working men to arms, arm yourself," on the first poster. August Spies sees that and he says, no, that's not what this is about. I won't speak if that's on the poster. They try to get back as many of those first posters as they can, and they publish a second poster without those lines. This becomes important during the trial in the future. It's the night of May 4th. It's time for this meeting. It's a dreary day. August Spies shows up. They have a hard time getting speakers there. They have to run around the city and grab people from other engagements, including Albert Parsons, to come over last minute to speak. The mayor of Chicago is there to see what is going on. They had hoped for 20,000 people to show up. About 2,000 show up. The mayor of Chicago watches for a little while. He says this is peaceful. He goes and he tells the police chief that they can stand down. This is not going to be anybody advocating for violence. It starts to rain. It's getting chilly. Now the crowd is down to about 200 people, and then down the street come 176 armed police officers. At the head of this phalanx of police officers, the captain says, "I command that you disperse." At the time, so the other speakers that had spoken earlier had already left. Albert Parsons had left. The other speakers had left. They're at a beer hall nearby. Just on the scene is August Spies and Samuel Fielden. Samuel Fielden is on the, and they had to jerry-rig a wagon. They didn't even have a platform for them to speak. It was so rushed. So he's on the wagon, and he says, "Well, I'm just wrapping up." And the police captain says, "No, you have to disperse." He starts to walk down from the platform, from the wagon, and a bomb is thrown. To this day, we don't know who threw that bomb. We can say pretty definitively that none of the men that are buried here threw that bomb. Someone threw that bomb. It explodes. One police officer is killed immediately. Chaos ensues. There's a lot of gunfire, predominantly from the police, shooting into the crowd. That night, 6 other police officers die, probably from friendly fire from the other police officers. We don't know how many of the protesters died. There's an estimation that at least 4, but the men that were wounded that were in the crowd obviously did not go to hospitals, and they were taken care of in people's homes or at nearby meeting halls. The next morning begins what you can say is the first Red Scare in America. Houses are broken into without warrants, printing presses are seized, people are denied the right to assembly. It becomes a manhunt to round up all of the people that they feel were advocating for social change. In the end, they accuse 8 men of the crimes of what had happened at the Haymarket. Albert Parsons had fled to Wisconsin, so they arrested 7 of the men and they put them into jail. On the day that the trial starts, Albert Parsons very dramatically walks into the courtroom. He is so convinced of his innocence that he comes and he joins the other defendants. The trial is so corrupt and so unjust, it becomes an international cause for people to protest. The judge is very clearly prejudiced against the defendants. The Chicago Tribune offered to pay any juror that found them guilty. The bailiff handpicked jury members and picked people that were prejudiced against the defendants. The defendants are denied the right to be heard separately. They are eventually all found guilty. 7 of them condemned to be hanged, and 1, Oscar Neebe, condemned for 15 years of hard labor. At the time, Oscar Neebe claimed that he would much rather be hanged with his companions than be sentenced to 15 years in prison. There are many appeals. In the end, 2 of the men that were convicted wrote to the governor asking for leniency, and their sentences were commuted to life in prison. So 5 men are condemned to be hanged. The night before the trial, Louis Ling, is found in his cell with half of his face blown off. Some people claim that he committed suicide. Some people claim that the police helped him along. He was among the defendants, one of the ones that was most vilified by the police, and admittedly a bomb maker. The other 4 men are condemned to be hanged. They go to the gallows. Their families are denied the right to come see them before they are hanged. Lucy Parsons and her children are kept in a waiting room and not ever able to say goodbye to Albert. As they come into the gallows, they sing the Marseillaise. They go up to the platform, and the hangman was so nervous. These men were such powerful orators, and everybody was so nervous about what they would say on the gallows that the hoods are put over their faces earlier than what was normally done. The hoods are put over their faces, and August Spies says the line that is engraved on the monument: "The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today." Albert Parsons, who was the only American, the other men that were condemned were primarily German, 1 was from England. Albert Parsons was the only American, and he says, and a very powerful orator, he says, "Will I be allowed to speak? Will I be allowed to say something?" And they pull the lever, and their bodies are dropped. Normally in a hanging, it's very quick. The necks are broken of the men that are being hanged. In this case, they struggled for 7 minutes. It was, by all accounts, a very gruesome death. Their bodies are collected. The only cemetery that will accept their bodies is right here in Forest Park. There was a great procession bringing the bodies out here to Forest Park. And immediately an organization was formed. The Pioneer Aid Society was formed in order to build the monument that we're now going to look at. So we'll take a minute and go look at the monument. In 1997, the Haymarket Martyrs Monument was designated a National Historic Landmark. And I thought I'd read a little bit about the reason why this site was picked instead of a site where the event actually occurred is because it didn't have as much physical authenticity. Some of the area had been changed because of the Kennedy Expressway, whereas this obviously has been the same since the bodies were received and the monument built. And I thought I'd read a little bit from the letter from Robin Bakken from the Newberry Library when they were applying for this to be the site of the National Historic Landmark. The Haymarket Martyrs Monument has provided a symbol through which various groups have been able to create a usable past and share pride in radical heritage. While the site where the Haymarket incident took place may be more authentic in its relationship to the event itself, the monument and cemetery symbolize the process of creating cultural heritage through a poignant, enduring legacy of collective identity. The Haymarket Monument's historical significance lies in its ability to promote Haymarket's legacy, to structure social memory, and to link present-day struggles to the past. So this is the amazing monument. After the Haymarket Martyrs were hanged, there was an amazing funeral processions from Chicago out here to Forest Park. Forest Park, at the time, this was a German Waldheim cemetery, and this was the only cemetery that would accept their bodies. This is a unique cemetery at the time in that it's a non-denominational cemetery. And if you get the chance to come out here in person, which I really encourage you to do, you will see that many of the monuments here have fraternal organization symbols on them, like the Odd Fellows or the Masons. Those weren't permitted in many cemeteries at the time that belonged to a religious denomination. But this cemetery welcomed the bodies. And when they first came out, there were throngs of people that accompanied them, and their bodies were interred here. Immediately, there was an organization, the Pioneer Aid Society, led by Lucy Parsons, widow to Albert Parsons, that started raising funds for this beautiful, incredible memorial. You'll notice that the symbolism of the memorial is a female figure placing a laurel wreath on top of a fallen worker. There's a lot of debate about the symbolism. Some claim that it is the symbolism from the Marseillaise song. Forgive my French. But there's also Blue Benton, who is a librarian here in Forest Park, has done quite a bit of research, along with Mark Rogovin, on the monument. And that's something I should mention too. It's such a living piece of history that people are still discovering many things about this whole movement. It's a very vibrant piece of history that continues to breathe. So as they were doing research, Blue Benton also found this poem that was well known to the Haymarket Martyrs at the time, Revolution by Ferdinand Freiligrath. Hopefully my German is okay. But it references a peasant girl who brings funeral wreaths. And it says, "I tell you, she is not dead." So you could make a good argument that that is the symbolism for this. But regardless, it's a very powerful symbol in that it is a female figure who could represent liberty and justice, placing a laurel wreath or a victory leaf or wreath on the head of the fallen worker. You'll see in front there are some fronds, some funereal fronds. In the 1980s, the original fronds were stolen. And we owe, as I mentioned, Mark Rogovin, who was very much the overseer of this monument, we owe to him the reproduction of the wreaths. So he found some historical photographs of the monument, and he also found one part of the wreath, the original wreath that had been left behind by the people that stole it. And we're incredibly lucky that directly across the street from the cemetery are world-class restorers. So they were able to take those historical photos and that little bit of wreath that Mark found and recreate what we see here. And you will see on the front, as we mentioned before, the inscription, "The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today," was very prescient. People come from all over the world to visit the Haymarket Monument. The reason why May Day is a holiday that celebrates workers' rights all around the world is because of the Haymarket Martyrs. It's not a coincidence that we don't celebrate it here in the United States. There was a movement to make sure that they did not become martyrs here in the United States as they have in the rest of the world. If you go to places like Mexico, you will find that the Haymarket Martyrs are revered. And many times we will get visitors from around the world that come to visit the monument, and they're saddened that here in America we don't understand the importance of what these men went through for the reason for us to have an 8-hour workday. The reason why many people have a 40-hour work week is because these men died, and the women that supported them also made sacrifices for us to have a 40-hour workday. The monument, when you come to visit in person, which I hope you do, you will also notice that many visitors that come from around the world will leave tokens of their respect, and as a sign that they have come and visited. We'll find many buttons, primarily union buttons, buttons that are advocating for workers' rights, flowers, coins. I have come several times and found people's ashes that have been left here in honoring them. This monument has been a long time a magnet for people to come and pay respect to the sacrifice that these working class heroes made on behalf of all of us. While we're still standing here talking about the historical history of the monument itself, um, we'll notice that around the monument are bases for what used to be a fence, an iron fence. We have some historical photos that show what it originally looked like. We believe in the 1980s when the fronds were stolen, probably when the chain links were stolen from here. It was people coming trying to make money off of the metal that was, sadly, they stole something so historically important for, you know, whatever pennies they could get for that. So like I said, the fronds at one point were stolen and replaced. Let's walk around to the back of the monument and we'll look at some of the stuff on the back. So now we're at the back of the monument, and you can see, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but engraved on the bottom are the 5 martyrs, the 4 that were hanged, and Louis Ling, who was found in his cell with his face blown off. I might have mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. That Albert Parsons was the only one of the martyrs who was of American descent. August Spies, Adolf Fischer, Louis Ling, Michael Schwab, Oscar Neebe were all either born in Germany or of German descent, and Samuel Fielden was from England. This plaque here is a reproduction. This was also stolen, probably right at the same time the fronds were stolen. And above it, you will see, as I had mentioned, that the 3 men that were not hanged, Oscar Neebe, and then Michael Schwab and Samuel Fielden, in 1893, they were pardoned by the governor at that time, Altgeld. And we have on the back of the monument his proclamation. When the fronds were stolen at the front of the memorial, and so much work had to be done to recreate the fronds, at that time it was decided that they would take an impression of this plaque at the back with Governor Altgeld's words. So on the off chance that somebody else desecrates the monument, it'll be much easier to recreate this plaque on the back of the monument. And he says, "These charges are of a personal character, and while they seem to be sustained by the record of the trial and the papers before me, and tend to show that the trial was not fair, I do not care to discuss the feature of the case any further because it is not necessary. I am convinced that it is clearly my duty to act in this case for the reasons already given, and I therefore grant an absolute pardon to Samuel Fielden, Oscar Neebe, and Michael Schwab this 26th day of June 1893. Was very politically unpopular. He did not have a second term, but those men were pardoned. The ashes of Oscar Neebe and Michael Schwab were brought here to the monument when they passed. They wanted to be with their companions. Samuel Fielden, we believe that his remains are on a farm, I believe, on the East Coast. While we're at the back of the monument, some of you might have heard about the search for a time capsule. So again, Mark Rogovin, whose dedication to the monument is just amazing, and Blue Benton were doing labor research, and they found an old newspaper from the time that described a time capsule being buried here at the monument. They did some research, they got ground penetrating radar, they believed that they had located the time capsule in that corner of the lot. They, with the help of some local college historians and archaeologists, they dug up what they found. There were 2 canisters in the ground. The top canister was identified as Oscar Neebe's ashes, and underneath was a cylinder. The cylinder didn't match what was in the illustration from the newspapers they had found, but they still decided to x-ray it, and it turns out it contained somebody else's ashes. We don't know whose ashes. So we have not found the time capsule that is buried here. There's some dispute as to where exactly it is. I recently communicated with Blue Benton, the librarian, And she believes that the time capsule is actually underneath the monument, and that time capsules at that time were not meant to be brought back up in a short period of time. They were meant to be there for the ages. So as I had mentioned earlier, the Haymarket uh, events and the trial resonated internationally, and they inspired, and August Bise was prescient with his words. The events were so powerful that they inspired many, many labor leaders who have asked to be buried near the Haymarket martyrs. We're going to visit some of the graves around here. You could do research into so many people buried here and find just layers and layers of interesting, compelling history. I always tell people that come here, you could make a million movies out of everybody that's buried here. So we'll try to touch on some of those stories. Some of them are probably well known to you, some of them not so much. I thought maybe we would start with Lucy Parsons. So we'll walk on over to Lucy's grave. So one of the cool things about the people that are buried around the monument is the diversity of the people, of our working class heroes. You're going to find women represented, African Americans, Latinx. It is a very vibrant movement, and especially when you think back to the 1800s, and I feel like Lucy Parsons really embodies that. She was a woman of mixed race. We now know that she was probably descendant of slaves, Mexicans, and Native Americans. But she was a labor leader in her own right, not just as Albert's wife. Right after the martyrs were hanged, she immediately started raising funds for this beautiful monument, and she kept advocating for workers' rights. She was one of the founding members of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And as we mentioned before, unions tend to be siloed within the occupations that they're representing, and the IWW is meant to represent all workers. She was a very feared speaker. Quite often she would be scheduled to give a speech and the police would show up and shut things down. Lucy's grave is visited by many people, and they leave many roses for Lucy. She died in a fire in Chicago, and her partner at the time died trying to save her from that fire. All right, let us go. The next one I would love to go see is Irving Abrams, who is right here. Irving Abrams was also part of the Pioneer Aid Society that raised money for the monument. And when he passed in 1980, he deeded the monument to the Illinois History Society, and that is who takes care of the monument now. And it's great that he gets to be so close to the monument. Now we're going to go over to the back of the monument. So this is Joseph Dietzen. This is where the book comes in handy, because so many of these labor leaders and advocates for workers' rights, their little bios are going to come in so handy, and you can really dive deep into all of them. But I love Joseph Dietzen. He was introduced by Karl Marx in Europe in 1872 as "here is our philosopher." And what is interesting to me is that he is revered in Wales. So he is, in South Wales, they regard his writings as the Bible. The miners in Wales really refer to him. So this is just, to me, a symbol that when you come here and you walk in the space around the monument, that this might have been a grave that you might have passed and not understood the historical significance. And he's right here so close to the martyrs. All right, now we're going to head over to the communist plot. So a lot of times you'll hear something referred to as a communist plot, and this is technically a communist plot. The events of the Haymarket have inspired so many people for workers' rights that they want to be buried near the Haymarket martyrs. Each of the people who are buried here have such compelling, interesting stories, and that's the book that I was pushing earlier is an amazing book to go and really delve into the histories of some of the people that are buried here. But I thought we could highlight some of them that are here. This is a great one, Henry Winston. "They took my sight, but my vision remains." And I'm going to cheat a little and look at my book. So he was born in Mississippi. Henry Winston was drawn in his teenage years to the struggles of the unemployed in Kansas City, Missouri. When he was a member of the Communist Party of the United States, when he was imprisoned in Terre Haute, he had deteriorating health because of a brain tumor, and he was criminally neglected medically, and he ended up losing his sight. So probably one of the most well-known people that wanted to be buried near the Haymarket Martyrs is Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman quite often attributed the Haymarket events as her political birth, that was what inspired her to become such an advocate for workers' rights. She was a very controversial character. She was kicked out of the United States. She lived in Russia for a while, became disillusioned with the communists in Russia, ended up living in Canada at the end of her life. And when she died, she asked that her remains be brought here to be near the Haymarket Martyrs. The interesting things about her, not only how beautiful the image of her on the marker is, the date of her death is wrong. She actually died in 1940, not 1939. And the date of her birth is a little bit wonky because she was born on the previous calendar in Russia. So it depends on how you interpret that date. The engraving on her headstone is particularly inspiring. Liberty will not descend to a people must raise themselves to liberty. She had a very controversial life. Emma's grave, along with the Haymarket Martyrs, draws a lot of pilgrims to come to visit her grave, and there are many items that are found here. On the side here, there's what looks like an inkwell and a link to, I believe it's a podcast, an anarchist podcast. Broken chains are quite often left here. In the Jewish tradition, when you visit a grave, you leave a rock or a pebble to show that you have visited, and Emma's quite often has that. There's a black anarchist flag here. It's a beautiful memorial. It's a little ironic. Also buried here in Forest Park is Billy Sunday, the televangelist or radio evangelist. His grave isn't too far away. Both he and Emma Goldman had a long-standing feud against each other, and I don't know which one is spinning faster, Billy Sunday or Emma Goldman, that they're both in the same cemetery. All right, let's look at some other people that are buried here that are close to the Haymarket Martyrs. So while we're here, here's Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and it says, of course, on her stone, the rebel girl, fighter for working class emancipation. She was a powerful speaker from a very young age, even as a teenager, and very prolific, very powerful and inspiring. And near her is William Z. Foster, and on his stone it says, working class leader, tireless fighter for socialism. He's a giant in the history of U.S. working movement. He worked with the IWW, the AFL, the CIO. He worked to organize workers in the meatpacking industry. He helped organize the United Mine Workers. He was a member of the Communist Party of the United States, and he was also a prolific author, writing many major books, including 2 autobiographical volumes and scores of pamphlets. His books include History of Other Americas, The Great Steel Strike and Lessons, Negro People in American History, and History of the Communist Party of the USA. It's pretty amazing to be among these pillars of history like this. So Nina Van Zandt Spies was a socialite. At the time, the trial of the Haymarket Martyrs was a cause celebrity, and so it was a lot of people would go to the courtroom to see what was going on. This is in the days, of course, before TV. And Nina Van Zandt at the time was a socialite, and she thought it would be interesting to go and watch the trial. And the defendants during the trial were portrayed in the newspapers as rabid, foaming at the mouth anarchists that wanted to overthrow government. And as she attended the trial day after day, she understood that these were well-learned men. These were people that were advocating for rights, and they weren't rabid dogs as they were being portrayed in the press. And the more time she spent at the trial, the more interested she became in August Spies. And she wanted to visit him. and in order to visit him, the visitors' rights were very limited, so they decided to become married so that she could see him more often. She had to marry him in absentia. Someone had to stand in place for him for the wedding in person with her. And then she was allowed to visit him more in his jail cell, and they fell deeply in love. After he was hanged, after the hanging, Nina, much to the horror of her wealthy family, continued to advocate for workers' rights and was disowned, and continued alongside with Lucy Parsons to advocate for workers' rights. We only recently got her headstone. Mark Rogovin was instrumental in making sure that she gets her marker here among the other advocates for workers' rights. So there's Nina. So one of the other cool things about this cemetery and learning about all of these working class heroes is that you're always learning new things. And I'm sure some of you that are watching this will be able to fill in some details about people buried here. Just a month or so ago, I was here visiting Eddie Balchowski's grave, and some relatives of his were here and filled in some details for me. So first of all, what I learned about Eddie Balchowski is he's an artist, a poet, a raconteur. He was a one-armed pianist. He went to fight fascism in Spain, and during that battle lost his arm, but continued to play the piano with one arm. Apparently he was well known around Division Street and the bars there. And I would, for many years, look at his headstone, and it says, "Your friends, family, and fellow premature anti-fascists salute you." And I didn't know what a premature anti-fascist meant. A month ago, a relative of Eddie Balchowski's was here giving a tour, and he said that the people that had gone to fight um, in the Spanish Civil War were frowned upon here in the United States, and when they tried to join the war movement here in the United States, they were denied because they were premature anti-fascists. So there's always something to learn. Maybe one of you who are watching this video might have some more information to fill in, but I thought that was really interesting, and I would have loved to have heard Eddie Balchowski playing the piano with one arm. Okay, so I'm going to use our handy dandy book to read some of the details about the Lightfoots. And again, it's just emblematic of the depth of stories of people that are drawn to be buried near the Haymarket martyrs. But I wanted to talk about this pair, Geraldine and Claude Lightfoot. So Claude was a leader of the African American liberation struggle. He was a scholar and revolutionary, served as a prominent leader of the Communist Party of the United States for nearly a half a century. Grew up on the south side of Chicago. And his wife also was an outstanding figure in the Chicago African American community. She was born in Mississippi and came to Chicago as a child. She married Claude Lightfoot, and for many years she was a leading member of the Communist Party of the United States, and she worked really closely with him until she developed a brain tumor. When she was stricken with a brain tumor, she was initially refused treatment in a Chicago hospital because it was led by a right-wing German refugee doctor who despised her political views. The hospital directors later apologized for the gross violation of the Hippocratic Oath. So you can see, similar to our other martyrs, her political views led to her impact on her health. While we're here, I also kind of want to point out the headstone Pellegrino. I think it's particularly interesting because of the hammer and sickle that are on the grave. We can look at that and the engraving, "Leaders in the struggle for mankind and to end discrimination in America." All right, so again, I'm going to refer to our handy dandy book. Buried here is Raya Dunayevskaya. She was Russian-born, one-time secretary to Leon Trotsky. She was among the first to call attention to Marx's early writings and prefigured the 1960s revival of the interest in Hegel. She developed the theory of state capitalism and the philosophy of Marxist humanism, focusing on the new beginnings for social transformation indicated by the Wildcat Strike, the Black Revolt, and the women's movement. So I think it's amazing that someone of her caliber asked to be buried near the Haymarket Monument. Let's see who else we can find. So here are a couple of my favorite headstones to visit. Anna Sosnovsky Wincourt. and I probably butchered that pronunciation, but it's a beautiful headstone, mother and comrade. If you get to come here in person, you can see how beautiful it is. She was born in the Ukraine to a family of 5 siblings. She came to New York with her mother, aunt, and 3 sisters. Um, she was part of a group of anarchists that were protesting World War I, and they threw leaflets in English and Yiddish outside of a New York City building, and they were found guilty of sedition. She fled, and later on she met her husband Abraham Winnocourt, and they became active in the defense of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were 2 anarchists that were arrested during the Red Scare. Next to her is Ben Reitman. Ben Reitman, and I'm going to turn my page here, but he was let me make sure I get. He was known as the King of Hobos, and he was the leader of the International Itinerant Migratory Workers Union, better known as the Hobos of America. He was a janitor, and he was taken under the wing by some doctors, and they helped him jump from a 4th-grade education to medical school. He was an avid lecturer on venereal disease, which is pretty controversial at the time. He met Emma Goldman, and they became lovers and co-workers for about 10 years. So here's where we have Voltairine de Cleyre, which is an amazing name. She was named after the philosopher Voltaire. She was a good friend of Emma Goldman's. Like Emma Goldman, she was also inspired by the events of the Haymarket Martyrs, and that's what led to her sort of political birth as well. Emma Goldman called her the most gifted and brilliant anarchist woman America ever produced. She was an author as well, and her ideas live on in many essays, poems, and several collections which are still in print. So there are other monuments and statues commemorating the events at the Haymarket. One was immediately after the incident, there was a police statue that was erected at the corner of Des Plaines and Randolph in the Haymarket. It has a very controversial history. It was a statue of a police officer mounted on top of a granite pedestal. It stood there for many years, and until it was toppled by a streetcar. Some say the streetcar driver purposefully knocked it over. The statue then moved from place to place, at sometimes being in Union Park. In the 1960s, the statue was vandalized during the upheaval over the Vietnam War. It was painted black at one point. It was blown up, rebuilt, blown up again, rebuilt. The first Mayor Daley then put a 24-hour police guard to watch it to make sure no one else had vandalized it. It became very controversial that the city was spending that much money on a 24-hour guard for a statue. So the statue was removed from its pedestal and placed in the police academy, where it can be watched for 24 hours by police officers. Recently, there has been a statue that's been placed at the site of the Haymarket, or what's close enough to the site. Studs Terkel was one of the organizers that fought very hard to get a statue and a plaque there to commemorate the actual site of the Haymarket incident. But as we mentioned before, this is probably the most historically significant spot to come and commemorate the Haymarket. I thought the other thing that I like to do at the end of the tour is ask for you to think about, so these events happened at the end of the 1800s. When do you think America got a federal law protecting an 8-hour workday? It wasn't until 1938 as part of the New Deal. So it's sad that it took that long for us to get those protections of our rights. I thought I'd wrap up reading part of the eulogy that was delivered here by the lawyer that represented the defendants, Captain William Black. And he says, "I must not keep you long, and yet there is one thing I specially want to say, because doubtless in this great throng there stand many who misapprehended their position and their views. They were called anarchists. They were painted and presented to the world as men loving violence, riot, and bloodshed for their own sake, as men full of an unextinguishable and causeless hatred against existing order. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were men who loved peace, men of gentle instincts, men of gracious tenderness of heart, loved by those who knew them, trusted by those who came to understand the loyalty and purity of their lives. And the anarchy of which they spoke and taught, what was it but an attempt to answer the question, after the revolution, what?" So whether or not you believe with the politics of the people that are buried here, we can always acknowledge that what they did was to benefit all of us, on behalf of all of us. So thanks again for joining us for the virtual tour of the Haymarket, and I hope to see you in person.